Hello again. Welcome to another episode. This episode is really an extension of our last. We wanted to talk a bit more about, I guess, the early stages, starting a business, some of the lessons learned, especially from each of us, in terms of what we would essentially tell ourselves if we were to go back and do it again, and potentially some advice for those of you out there that are both contemplating starting something or are currently in the phase of an early stage company. Our experience is definitely on the early stage 0 to 1. So for those of you that are later on, hopefully you can glean some insights from the discussion today. But we're really focused on, again, trying to originate businesses, and some of the guidance and advice, lessons learned that we have, and hopefully help you avoid some of those pitfalls along the way. So with that, I think the first question is, to each of us is, it is very important, to plan and to prepare what it is you want to do. Obviously, you have to have the desire to launch a business and do it yourself, or you may be contemplating whether or not it is a good idea. So I think that's that early stage in terms of getting your head and your ducks in a row mentally is quite important. And I know personally it took me a number of years to build up the confidence and the courage to be able to do that in the first place. So I guess the first question would be, what sort of process did each of us go through, and how did it go? What would you tell yourself? What did you learn, and what sort of lessons and learnings did you get along the way? Anyone want to jump in?
Andrew, do you want to go or you want me to kick it off?
Yeah, Mike, why don't you kick it off?
Yeah, so what, I'll just answer part of the question. You could tackle the other half. I'll talk about the finances portion. And because Andrew and I, for our listeners, Andrew and I were the two founders of Boardwalk Insurance. So we experienced we were in the trenches from the very beginning. So we both had very similar experiences to starting up a business. I'll talk financial. Obviously, Andrew, maybe you can delve more into, the planning side of things that people seem to neglect. So I think, like Kyle mentioned, it did take several years to make the decision to start up. We had some really good jobs, secure, high paying, enjoyable. But I guess, we started questioning, was there more out there? And I think a lot of people have this question. Some of these individuals have this burning question early on at a young age, but most get it when they start getting to the early middle of their career. The early middle of their career, they start questioning, maybe there's more for me out there, or maybe I could be doing more. Same, Kyle, like 2 years it took, of maybe even more. Like the seed was planted, I would say like 3 years before we ended up launching. 3 years, you're thinking about it. Then it starts getting more serious. You start mulling it over. And then 2 years before we launched, I'd say a year and a half to 2 years, I started really thinking about it seriously. We're going to do this. Now it's about being prepared financially. So that's one aspect of it. So a lot of entrepreneurs, obviously, there's a lot of fear in starting up because there's no more stability. You're losing all that stability. You don't know what you're going to make in year one. You're not on a salary anymore. There's no cushion. There's no buffer. So you have to be prepared financially to make that move. And I think what really helped me make that move was preparing financially. I started really diving deep into my cost of living. I started doing monthly budgets, run rates, burn rates. What do I need to live on? How much is my cost of living? What are my operating costs to live personally? And how can I try to tighten that up? I was looking at ways to tighten that up as well. Maybe we don't need to be so lavish on our espresso bean. Maybe we can go for a cheaper coffee bean, or hey, you know what? Maybe we don't need to take that extra trip this year. We're going to just keep it down to half a trip, a weekend trip. So I started looking at all these things and started really building a good personal budget, and then building up cash flow and a little reserve. So having that reserve ready gave me the confidence to really step into entrepreneurship, because I knew that, hey, you know what, if we have a rough year, we have a rough couple of years, we can weather this storm. So being financially prepared was very important.
No, that's good. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, in the early years, it was very tough. So yeah, Mike, I'll probably dive more into the the preparation and even the planning before that. Because for me, it goes back even like a very long time ago. I think in my early 20s, I kind of knew that, eventually this is my end goal is to, dive into, starting a business, starting a business from scratch. And it's essentially a goal of mine for a long time. So I've been preparing this for years. And I think it's really stemmed from those first few years of working and maintaining that discipline. And I've maintained that discipline, I think, from my early 20 when I first started working. I knew that my goal, and I think my first goal was to essentially save up 1 year's worth of salary and deploy that money out into the market and multiply that for as many times as possible, as many x as possible, and that is going to give me the number of years it will to survive on this kind of salary to eventually work on my own project, right? Work on my own business. So it's really takes many years to really plan that. And in my early days, I remember, when you get out of school, one of the big thing is you don't have any money. It's very hard to save up 1 year's worth of salary. It can take 5 years, 8 years for some, right? Like it takes a long time. So what I did was instead of buying that new car, I I went and I leveraged. I borrowed the amount of money that it would cost to buy a brand new car. I financed that. I deployed that into the market and I invested that from very early age, and that essentially compounded and grew into my 30s. Now it gave me a nice nest egg that I can probably survive for a couple years, several years. That now gives me that buffer to not basically, I didn't take the approach that Mike took with changing my lifestyle. I try to maintain the same lifestyle, by essentially utilizing this nest egg that I've built, right? And that's my runway to get this business up and running and get it to the point that is cash flow positive, that I can start taking a salary. And that's kind of my strategy, my plan, and that's why it took many years, to actually plan for this.
It's a high risk strategy, though, that's for sure. Definitely a better strategy if it works out. But if the market doesn't, go the direction you're hoping it to go, there's not going to be much nest egg left. So I took a more conservative approach, for sure. Andrew took a more purpose driven, like a investing approach. Luckily, the market supported and he made the right decisions, so he was able to maintain that lifestyle. But that if the markets don't go your way, that's the only you know
Well,
disclaimer I want to put out there.
I'll explain that. I'll explain that further. I think like it's regardless of where the market's going, I think it's, listen, in my early years, I invested in insurance companies. I invested in very conservative type investments that never really grew crazy multiples. But it's really, part of it, you're right. It's the, being in the right place at the right time. It was right around the financial crisis. So those things did really well. And then, we had the tech boom after that. So yeah, it's really, being in the right places at the right time to allow for a lot of these compounding. But it's, as a young person, that's when you can take that risk, right? Like I can take that risk.
Yeah,
And
that's why you started your approach much earlier, because you need the time to take that approach. If you're
exactly,
doing it in a shorter window, then it's very risky. But if
very
you're
risky.
doing it over, like you said, like a 10-year period, it's a little different.
So
Yeah.
for me is it just to jump in there? It's if that didn't work out, right? If that didn't work out as planned and it blew up in my face, I wouldn't start, in my 30s. I would just probably just end up working. But by taking that chance, by taking that bet, it gave me the opportunity to do this. So either way, if it pays out, if it doesn't, I would just probably just continue working, right? And that's but because I've done that, it kind of gave me this buffer and this comfort to do it.
For you,
Yeah,
Kyle, what was
I
your
think
start like?
so. I have a couple different startup experiences. So I would just add that I think the the perspective. So one of the I would say is one of the bad pieces of advice I got, that I didn't act upon, that I thought was a bad piece of advice, was I was at a conference years ago, and I think it was a couple of VCs in the U.S. were talking about the level of commitment that they wanted to see from prospective portfolio companies. So these are, again, founders that are starting companies. And just a bit of background. So I've started a couple companies. Most recently is SureRisk, which is an insurance technology software company. But I've also started a company based around hardware, which really grew out of a hobby with a group of us. And it is a very, very different proposition. So we'll talk a bit about the different types of businesses and how they relate to this runway conversation, because I think it's very important. But anyways, this piece of advice that for whatever reason stuck with me as being really misleading and misguided is that they essentially said, we want to see exposure from the founder. We want to see you've got skin in the game and that you're essentially going to be destitute if this doesn't work out. And they said, like, if you need capital, we want to see you maxing out your credit cards. We want to see you mortgaging your house. Like, we want to see you go to the wall. And I understand the perspective, but I don't agree with it. I think that you as an individual, irrespective of your status as a business owner or whatever, you need to look after yourself. You need to be responsible, and it needs to be, if anything, you need to show some pragmatism in running the business the same way that you would your personal financial health. So I don't agree with some of the experts out there that say, we want to see a lot of exposure. We want to see a lot of leverage. We want to see you taking these big risks. I don't believe in that. That said, I also agree that there isn't necessarily a one size fits all. So if you feel like, I agree with the sentiment that you need to essentially budget at least 1 year, probably more depending on the type of industry, especially if it's a service clientele based industry, to build up enough of a reputation and a book of business that you can actually start harvesting some return business. So I would say at least a year of expenses paid. And Michael makes a very, very good point, which is you really, really need to cut absolutely everything you possibly can, because every dollar saved is a dollar of extra runway. And that could mean, again, if you can reduce your expenses, and this applies equally to the business, if you can reduce your expenses significantly, like your nest egg or whatever savings or debt or whatever you're using to fund your business will have a significantly larger impact on your ability to execute. And so you need to be very clear about balancing those two things. But again, I don't believe there's a one size fits all. I understand people that say, hey, I'm going to take out a bunch of debt, and if it doesn't work out, I'll have to pay it back, and I'm okay with that. But I'd rather just do it that way, because that's the strategy I want to chase.
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense. So yeah, I think there's a lot around the financial runway, and we can talk about this the whole podcast. Let's talk about also, when I mentioned planning, I'm talking about like the business planning. Like, how long would you say it takes from idea, concept to execution, to actually launching the thing, turning the lights on and putting up the sign? How long did that take you, Kyle? And then Andrew, you can talk to that as well.
So this is a really interesting and a personal sort of experience for me, because the one of the businesses that I started early on was a financial services driven business that I didn't have any direct experience in. And the reason I went after it was I thought that I could leverage my experience in one dimension to sort of apply it to another. And it was a case study in what not to do in terms of research, the ins and outs of what that business, like essentially the business model, what you're going to do to generate revenue. And I made a couple fundamental mistakes, which was, these apply to anybody, starting a business, but essentially, what is the value proposition? It's not so much how are you going to make money, because I think that's really easy for most people to solve, but it's what value are you providing in exchange for that money? And so I had went down the path of investing, venture capital, private equity type stuff, and what became readily apparent was we had the opportunity to raise a significant amount of money. However, what it turned out to be was essentially we gathered enough rope to hang ourselves, as the phrase goes. So we could have essentially hit a critical mass, but the problem is would we have been able to execute and provide the level of returns, the level of fees necessary to operate that business? Would we have seen the deal flow necessary to make it work? And we may have had a very unconventional strategy that in theory would have paid off, but you need to be really, really mindful of what is the traditional way of doing something, and why is it that traditional way, right? It's really motivating and it's really inspirational, and a lot of early stage founders are like, I'm going to change the world by doing things differently, and some of them do, but it's very, very difficult in some cases to go against the grain, and there's probably reasons why the industry operates the way that it does, or the systems that you believe are broken are the way that they are. So I think you need to be really, really critical and self-critical about how much of it is, a pie in the sky idea in terms of I want to change the world and I think that this is a great way of doing it, to let's start at, first principles and like, how am I going to make money? How do people in the industry today make money? And you need to be able to replicate that. And I would say start there and then iterate, unless it's something absolutely transformative that, again, you have confidence in changing the business model and reinventing that industry or a new one.
So you're saying do your research, validate, and then really work on your go-to-market strategy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead, Andrew. I have some things. Go ahead.
I'll mention some, and then
Yeah.
you can jump in on some
Please.
of them, Mike. I think we tag team on Boardwalk, so it's just there's a lot of overlap here. But I'm going to just mention one big thing for me, and that was starting any businesses is going to be very tough, very challenging, it's very time consuming, and the planning can be a very lonely journey. I think a part of the decision and part of the success will be finding that right co-founder, finding that right individual that that you can clash with, that at the same time can come to a mutual understanding and like fist pump at the end of the day. That's the type of co-founder you need to have, and I think having that co-founder in your corner and working alongside is going to help make the planning and the execution a lot easier. Right. And so I think, a lot of that can, it's interesting is that the co-founder can be found anywhere. Right. It could be in your work environment, could be through mutual friends, whatever it is. But, it's interesting that, it's very important to have that co-founder that you trust, because it makes the planning and everything a lot easier. And having that mutual vision and that same vision and having that vision, working towards that vision, it's tough. It's like I'd say, it's like a second marriage, right? So if you cannot stand that person and you cannot resolve issues, quickly, that's where I've heard most of these startups fail for that reason. That's when co-founder clashes. So I'd say even before the starting of the planning and everything, finding a co-founder is very important.
No, 100%. And thankfully, we found each other, Andrew. But you know what? You'll never get to know someone as well as you get to know someone until you go into business with them. And Andrew's right. It's like a marriage. You're like, you're right in the weeds with that person. So doing a lot of the preliminary discussion up front definitely helps. I think, like you mentioned, Andrew, having that alignment with each other and thinking long term, because it's easy to think short term. Hey, we want to build this, we want to launch this, like Kyle said. But let's think about what do we foresee in 5 years, in 10 years, because that's usually when partners, their goals and their vision sometimes end up going apart from one another. They end up veering apart from one another. Think about when you're shooting a gun. I shoot guns, so at close range, the bullet doesn't veer far. But if you're shooting a target that's 300 yards out, one little millimeter of a difference makes all kinds of feet of difference. So I think looking that far out and saying, hey, what's the vision? What's the strategy? What's our end game? And kind of defining that up front. And that was hard for me, because when we were starting, I'm like, I don't know what my end game is. We haven't even started the business yet. And you're starting to have conversations about the end goal. It was challenging, but it was a good exercise, because it got us to really think and really express what each of our, even though the business hadn't started yet, what is both of our end games, and we had to make sure we were able to find alignment there, or a strategy that could get us both to that checkpoint.
Yeah, no, that's right.
I think it's a really interesting question, because there's no doubt I agree with everything you're saying in terms of the level of commitment and marriage that occurs between people that create companies. I think this, I don't know what the specific percentages are, but definitely more companies fail because the team, breaks up or the founders fall out than companies that, run out of money. So it's at least, if not more critical, obviously, to than, the product and the capital and stuff like that. But I would also caution against, in my experience, hiring or creating a team for the sake of creating a team. And what I mean by that is, if you feel like, and this is doubly relevant for the era of AI, because if you feel like you have a good handle of what you want to do in the product and the service, and you could probably supplement what you're doing, you know, 80% rather than hiring somebody or bringing somebody in as a co-founder. If you're struggling to find a co-founder, I definitely on the opinion that it's not an imperative anymore. I think years ago, especially when it came to founding the business and funding it, obviously the more people involved, the greater the bootstrapping capacity, all that kind of stuff. You can do a lot more with a greater number of people. But if you're struggling or there really isn't a requirement to do that, if you feel like, for example, software is a great example where if you can write some code yourself and launch a product and essentially host and activate that product for a very little amount of money, and you really don't need a lot of shared services and finance and accounting and stuff like that, or boots on the ground doing things, there's not really a requirement that you necessarily have to have a co-founder.
That's a good differentiator, Kyle. The boots on the ground and the moving parts. I agree. If you don't have to take on a co-founder, you'll simplify your life. You're taking on more uncertainty and variables by taking on a co-founder. However, you said it there, like if you need the boots on the ground, and there's a lot of facets to the business, you need. I'm not going to say you need. It really helps having those additional bodies, especially the additional bodies with skin in the game, because they're going to give a different level of care and a different level of output. So like the type of business we launched, I could just say it right now, if I had to do this on my own, it would be very challenging. There were so many things we had to get going, and one person can only do so much unless, I was given a bag of cash and I can hire all these people. But even so, like even hiring these people, you're still going to have, you're not going to have that care. So
I think it's yeah, like you're right, Mike. Like the care and everything is very important. But what I think is, as a founder in the first place, you have to understand yourself and understand your weaknesses, and that's key. I right out of the gate, I knew my weaknesses. I knew what I need to supplement with a co-founder, right? Like you kind of realize these things, and that's what you
you
look
couldn't
for.
supplement it with AI.
You can't. Well, there's certain things that you can't. Like, think about
Certain
it, Mike.
things.
Like, so, like, is AI gonna do public speaking, which you're good at? Is AI gonna, go out there and sell to the clients? It's not gonna be able to do that. There are certain things that that you're very good at, and like even okay, we have AI now that can help us do analysis and everything like that, but it's not the same. Like care that you're saying, it can agree with me on anything. So I can talk to AI, and it'll be the perfect marriage. But you need that clash. This is what I think. You're putting stones in the into this tumbler, and you keep on turning it, and it'll clash against each other, and it'll come gems on the other side, right? Like it's you need to have that clash, and that's I think is what Mike and I went through a lot of that at the beginning. We clash on, well, we agree on a lot of things, but we also clash on many things. But that gives us perspective. Who's going to give me that perspective? AI is not going to be able to give me that perspective because it's going to eventually agree with me.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's I think it's these little things like supplement your weaknesses with a co-founder and have to gain different perspective. I think that's one of the keys to succeeding in building a business.
Yeah, I shouldn't shortchange, there's no question that having like-minded founders, like hats off to my co-founders, Jake and Chris. Like, if you find people that are like-minded, it's absolutely indispensable. There's no question about it. Everything gets easier. It's a lot better to challenge each other, to circulate ideas. Everybody's going to have those rough days, and if you have people around you that are fighting the same fight, it's exponentially easier. So there's no question that it is preferable, and if you can do it, do it. But if you're really racking your brain and you're just not finding people and you're struggling, don't feel like you need somebody to get started, because I don't think you do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, we've encountered a lot of successful entrepreneurs, solo entrepreneurs, and hats off to them because some of them have built very large, successful businesses on their own, which is impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and when it's tough, when the going gets tough, it really helps when you have someone in your corner. And when you're on your own and you can push through that, you got some grit, good on you.
Yeah. So I guess the next phase, question would be once you have the idea and you've started and you've got, the founding team around you, if that's your choice, um, how do you guys look back on where you invest your time? How do you prioritize what's important from day one, and where do you direct your energy?
So before I answer that question, I'm just going to mention one last thing that I like kind of a lesson that I learned along the way, and the lesson that I learned along the way, if I can go back in time and give myself this advice, the advisors, the advisory board, how important it is to select those key advisors and get the right people in your corner from the beginning. And sorry, Kyle, I know I'm taking your question completely out of context here, but I think that's very important to mention because when you're starting a business, you think you don't know it all. You think you know it all, but you need key advisors on the board or in your corner that can give you the right advice. And if you don't have that, you're going to learn everything the hard way, and it's going to cost you time and money, which is very precious in our business. Time
Okay,
and
so
money.
this is a bit of a rabbit hole. So let's go down the advisory board rabbit hole because, in my perspective, especially in the technology space, it's definitely fallen out of favor in the last 5 years, 5 to 10 years. It used to be absolutely imperative that you'd have, a large, let's say more than 10 people involved in some way in an advisory capacity. You would typically be paying them at least equity, if not cash and equity. And in many cases, they would be one of the first slides. They'd be next to your team slide, or they'd be on your team slide in your deck. And I've definitely seen a trend away from that, and there's a de-emphasis on advisors to the point where most VCs don't even care and they don't want to see it. So I agree with you in the sense that if again, similar to team, if you have influencers in your space, if you have people that have some gray hair, that have been there, done that, that have connections that can, make your life easier, definitely try and engage with them. But what would you say, is reasonable in terms of compensation, in terms of commitments for time? Where do people start? If they say, okay, I want to try, there's a few people that I've identified, let's say 3 or 4, what would you say is the starting point?
Andrew, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think well, first of all, yeah, you would really have to vet these advisors very early on, and I guess one of the things that I would say is the best form of compensation for advisors, if it's possible, is monetary. Equity can get very expensive. You might think it's cheap to give away equity at this point because they're worth nothing. But think about the amount of time that you're putting into building this business, and it can be very valuable down the road. And that small bit of equity, even if it's just 0.1% or 0.25% or whatever it is that you give away that you think is very minimal because it's worth nothing right now, can be worth a lot of money down the road. Can be worth hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. So, you really have to think careful about that. And I think, setting aside a certain amount of money to pay these advisors for an hour of their time there, here and there, gives you the opportunity to also vet them to see, hey, you know what? Do I want these advisors on for an extended period of time to help me? Are they in a position to help you? Because quickly, like just like in an interview, people can say whatever they want. They can be the best person, the most knowledgeable. But once you get into the trenches and you start obtaining this advice, um, that's when you know if they're quality advisors or not. And there are tons of advisors out there that will set you down the wrong path, like Mike says. It will cost you time and money, as if it's not having an advisor at all. So so it's just very important to vet the advisor early. Don't give up equity early, and and just pay them for their time, and then vet them before you actually bring them on as like advisors with equity.
Yeah, I think a lot of founders make the mistake of thinking that the advisor is doing them such a privilege, and they're doing them such a favor to be on the advisory board, and in in a certain degree it is. But I think what Andrew mentioned is very important, and a lot of founders neglect to vet those advisors. It's no different than hiring a VP for a role. If you're hiring a VP for a role, you're going to interview them, you're going to vet them. Even more so, you should be doing even more so for an advisor. And if you can compensate them with cash, with monetarily, that makes sense. If you're cash strapped, if you're a cash strapped startup, which a lot of people are, then obviously they go the equity route, and it's usually what I've seen. I don't know, Kyle, you could speak to it, but it's like what Andrew mentioned, anywhere from like 0.1 to 0, to quarter percent equity, 0.1 to a quarter percent. I'm sure there's been instances where it's been even higher than that, a little bit higher, 0.5%. But that's what we've seen out there. I've seen out there. But if you can avoid it and go the monetary route, you'll thank yourself later.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, I just to quickly round that out, I think that everything you said is I would agree with, and definitely the preference is to reduce dilution and equity as much as possible, because Andrew's right that it does amount to a lot. It can amount to a lot in the future. That said, a lot of advisors, again, if you can't pay their hourly of, in some cases, thousands of dollars, you have to offer them equity, and there's a lot of templates online. Do some research in terms of contracts and levels of commitment and stuff like that. It has become somewhat standardized, especially in the technology space. But one final point that I would make on that is coming back to the original question of whether or not you would even need it, is I would make sure that in vetting them, there's a clear understanding of what the value prop is for you. I think too many times people get invested and involved in advisors because they look good, or they work for a large company and they can put the logo, they think about putting the logo on their fundraising deck or whatnot. And in reality, if the advisor doesn't put any time into bettering your business and your product or service, or doesn't help you open some doors in terms of clients and revenue, what is the value add there? And I think again, I think you'd be surprised at how little of a difference an advisory board makes if it's not actually moving things forward on your desk on the day-to-day basis.
Yeah, so that answers your question, Kyle. Now I could see why certain investors wouldn't really care for an advisory board. It all depends what the advisory board is bringing, and I think that makes total sense. That's another area that we probably could have improved on when we started, is being more clear on what the expectations were from this advisory board, and not just, we focused on a time commitment. We focused on, okay, we're going to meet with you this often. You're going to give us advice on, we're going to talk about these things. You're going to help us with this strategy. But we should have pushed it a little further. We should have pushed it and said, these are the defined outcomes. This is what we need to achieve together. And I don't think we did that. But if we did do that, those advisors are invaluable, in my opinion.
Yeah,
the right
that's a
ones.
good point.
The right ones.
Yeah. Yeah. So again, coming back to that sort of 0 to 1, where, looking back, would you, change the level of commitment or the time that you invested on certain tasks? Where do you feel like that investment paid dividends the most, and you would do the same thing, or you would double down on certain activities? What do you guys think, if you were to do it over again, or you were to talk to your younger selves rather, what advice would you give?
Yeah, well, I'll start it off because I know how we started. And like we have sales backgrounds. I have a sales background, so I focused on the thing I know best, which is selling. So right from early on, I would just hit the ground running hard on the sales front, which is good because it was able to give the business revenue lift right away. However, that's a two-sided sword, because now you're neglecting some of the other things, such as the systems, the processes, and the marketing, and building that really that value proposition, building the ICP. We had an ICP, but it was kind of wishy-washy. Ideal client profile, all these things, and building the real branding and the marketing, that was neglected because I just hit the ground running. Andrew and I hit the ground running on the sales side. Andrew was really pushing the system. He was investing a lot of energy into the system, which is good, our technology stack. So that was good. Andrew was pushing on that. I was pushing hard on the sales, but I think you also have to really nail down that brand, because that brand is so important. You know, it attracts employees, it attracts partners, it attracts customers, and I think that's something you can't neglect. That's my take. That's my quick hot take.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of the things that when we first started, it just one, how we started with Boardwalk was essentially bootstrapping a lot of the funding. So we were really focused on the sales and generating that revenue, right? And reinvesting a lot of that money back into the tech. So, there was very little room to make mistakes, for us, very little room to make mistakes. And it's, I think, in the first couple of years, we were focused on just generating revenue like crazy. Mike was out there, hitting the grounds, making whatever sale he can make, and same with me. It's like whatever come my way, I just push as many sales through as possible to reinvest into the company, and I think that's where most founders should do anyway. Like I don't know, like if I had to go back and do it differently, I don't know if I would do anything different here. I think
But
we
do you
made
think the founders should be the ones selling, or should they
I
be building a team that sells, or maybe that's not
I
feasible right
think,
at the beginning?
yeah, because again, I get, bringing that back to the point that we bootstrapped the business. We've invested very little into the capital into the business, and we put in a lot of sweat equity to get this thing off the ground. So a lot of that had to generate revenue to allow us to gain that capital, the cash flow to reinvest back into the business, and that I think is it gets the founder out there to learn from the ground floor what it means to sell, to get your hands dirty. And essentially, there were things that we couldn't do. So we had to hire and get support for. But I think at the end of the day, I look at it like a business. If we don't generate the revenue, if we don't generate cash flow, who is it on? It's on the founder. And that's
So,
that's that's us, right? So we have to do whatever we can to generate revenue, and that's what we did.
so you guys are in an interesting position because you invested a lot of time and money into your technology stack, which most companies generally, and definitely companies in the industry, do not do. So where you guys are saying obviously that your focus was on selling while building the technology stack. Did the technology stack exist when you picked up the phone for the first time, or was there a bit of a gap between when you started building the platform and you built essentially all of your systems that you would need internally, or that you wanted to build internally before you picked up the phone?
So I'll answer this one,
Great
Mike.
question, Kyle. That's a good question.
The idea of Harbor, our system, it was conceptualized 2 years before we even hit before we even started Boardwalk. We were sitting in the coffee shop drawing UIs and stuff like that on a napkin, and that was so the platform was always the goal from day one. So when we first launched, when we first hit the ground running, we had a very uh, poor, bad
Very
MVP.
minimum viable product. I
Yeah,
wouldn't even
very
call it a
minimal.
minimum viable
Yeah,
product.
like it was so minimal that it was like a glorified, I'd say, Google Drive. Like it was very bad. Right? And it just with a ugly UI as well.
Really bad.
But you know what? We started working on, Mike and I, we both agreed to work on this platform regardless of how bad it is, because that sets the tone at the company. Is that we are working on our platform, and this is what's going to give us our edge, and this is what's going to give us our difference. And so we were working on this platform for a few years, and until we mucker up the courage to hire our own full stack developer in house full time, that the platform started taking off, right? Because we don't have tech background, so that really made a difference. That really took the platform to the next level. But yeah, like we started from day one working on our own system, our own proprietary system, and that was kind of like part of the DNA of Boardwalk.
It was painful, but we did it, Kyle.
Yeah, that's awesome. No, and I think the message there is is important, which is sales. I think if I look back at my personal and professional experience. So my part of my business background is I did an MBA, and it's ironic because like a lot of the stereotypes are quite true in the sense that there's analysis paralysis. And you know, if you go down the path of like, oh well, I need to perfect this marketing plan, I need to perfect this product, I need to perfect this pitch, and I need to get, you know, ICPs are important, but they don't need to be like 10-page glossies. Like, you know, like you need the bare bones, and then you really need to get out there. And there's a guy that I follow by the name of Rob Snyder, Snyder, that he's similarly, so he did you know, an Ivy League MBA in the US, and he essentially started a couple companies, and he was like, nothing that I was taught translated. Like everything that you're told in terms of like research, and you know, coming back to our research question, like this is to the nth degree of research and preparation, and you know, crossing every T and dotting every I. And a big pitfall is essentially waiting years and years and years to build and build before launching or selling whatever it is that you're going into business to do. And his ethos is essentially you should sell first and build second. And obviously that doesn't apply to all businesses, but really what he's getting at is you have to validate demand. You have to validate that the customer wants to give you money for what it is that you want to do or what you believe that they want to give you money for before you can rationalize actually building the solution. And it's interesting because there's an old adage in the software world where essentially you consult with a company. You don't have a product. You go to a company and say, what problems do you have? Okay, well, if I build you the solution, you'll give me X amount of dollars. And then you build the solution for them, and then you resell that solution as many times as you can to other companies that have that problem. And that's really the sort of the same similar ethos that Rob, you know, extols, which is start with one case study. You don't need to have a product. You don't even need to have an idea. You just need to talk to people, get on the phone, figure out what it is that they want to buy and what problems they have, like hair on fire problems that are immediate and necessary, and then try and solve those problems. And if along the way you're able to replicate that again and again and again, it may turn into a scalable business. But definitely I would caution, you know, crawling into as the phrase goes, the pain cave, and developing a fully fledged perfect product in your mind over, you know, 5 years. Like there's a good example, the product Canva, from what I understand, listening to podcasts and reading their origin story, is they essentially spent 3 years building that product. And that is a very, very risky way of going. And a lot of companies have done that, and they've essentially launched where there isn't enough demand, there isn't product market fit in the sense that people don't want to pay for it or they don't want it the way that it was built. And you've essentially burned 3 years of perfect modeling and perfect production and all of these things that you've spent your time and energy on, and it just doesn't pay off.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a really good point, especially because think about how many times businesses pivot as well. So we can all attest to this. Like I'm sure, you know, Servisk has gone through this, Boardwalk has gone through it. So, you know, your business changes, it evolves and it pivots, and you could only figure out these things through the operations. You can't plan for them. So yeah, you plan, but then as you start operating, you really uncover stuff that's hidden under the dirt, deep under the dirt. And then you have to like, oh, we have to pivot. We got to change. We got to adapt. So things really change. So you're right. Without starting that operation, without getting going, you would never really uncover these things. But product market fit is very important. I think that's solving that problem is key. You need to be like committed, have a burning desire to really understand the problem and find the solution to address it. Mm-hmm. Not just say we're solving a problem, like talking to as many people as possible to figure out what that problem is.
Yeah.
Sorry, Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say, like, you know, what's interesting is that for our businesses, it was a little bit different because we're not like a software company. We're an insurance brokerage, right? So, you know, for us, it's really building that technology to help us optimize efficiency and really gaining that additional efficiency that will help us become more competitive on the market. So it was just we're just being laser focused on identifying those inefficient areas and patching them up with technology as much as possible. So for us, I think the product market fit for us was really, I guess when we first started, was to we didn't know if we were going to go after small business or mid-market enterprises, right? Like it was for us, it was kind of trying to figure out that piece of it and where our software is really going to help us become more efficient. Is it on the small business side or in the mid-market side, right? So that I think was for us the equivalent of finding product market fit. Whereas we don't have, I guess, some of those problems with building a tech that is trying to solve a very specific problem for many businesses and selling that, right? So, which is interesting though. But you're right. Like a lot of people spend a lot of time building that perfect product, and then find out they can't sell this thing because there's no demand for it, right? It's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. And you alluded to this part, Michael, but like part of the selling journey that I would go back and tell myself to spend more time on and actually approach a little bit differently is the ICP portion, which is again, ideal customer profile. And what it means to me, there's always obviously a lot of different definitions depending on how you approach it. But to me, the ideal customer profile should be essentially the smallest group of potential clients that you can reach out to. And what I mean by that is I have found it beneficial to make that profile, demographics, geography, size of company, what are they doing, what are their potential revenues, what size, how many staff do they have, all of that kind of stuff. If you can have as much specificity as possible and make it as small and as niche as possible, it really, really helps clarify what that conversation, what the sales process will look like.
Yeah.
I know, acting as a generalist in the past in my career, you have to, try and be many things to many people. And as a result, you're kind of an inch deep and a mile wide. Whereas if you go after a niche, and this helps us, especially so if the business that you're building and launching is naturally like directed at a very specialized segment, it goes contrary to what most people say and what I pursued early on, which was let's make it as big and as broadly applicable as possible because we want this big addressable market. So we want this something that's quite generic and generalist so that anybody anywhere could potentially be interested in it. Well, the problem with that is it's really counterproductive in terms of trying to focus that sales energy and that attention on a specific, very, very, very unique individual customer and saying, this is the right customer. This is the perfect customer for my solution for these reasons. And this is how I'm going to approach them. And this is why, that unique approach will work for that customer and it won't work for another, which will help, ultimately help you sell and help you,
Yeah,
find success.
it really helps with the messaging. Like you said, the sales process, the messaging. When you're doing all these things, when you're going super broad or super generic, it is difficult to define a really impactful message, a really impactful sales process. Even the training, the team members you're hiring. When you kind of have that dialed down, everything else starts to make sense, and it's easier to refine those things. I like that. I'm going to use that. So an inch deep and a mile wide. I like that. One more thing before we cap off. I don't know. We're approaching that 1 hour mark. First hire. What is the first hire for business owners? I guess, it's really dependent on what type of business you're running, obviously, but let's talk an inch deep and a mile wide. What's your first hire?
So I would say, again, it depends on the business. It depends on what the priorities of the business are and what the capabilities of the founders are. So I would say typically, if the founders are technical and not doing a lot of sales or not strong in sales, then you want to have that first hire to help supplement whatever your weaknesses are. So inversely, if your founding team is strong commercially but don't have a great development background, then you obviously want to hire a technical lead to lead that. But I would say on the sales piece, I think it's incredibly important that regardless of the background of the founders, that they get their hands dirty selling and stay involved in talking to customers, because that's the direction of the business. So even if it's, you're getting help from an SDR or, you've hired a sales executive to essentially do everything full stack, soup to nuts, still be involved in that process and try and glean as much information from it as you can.
Really good. Andrew, what do you think?
I think the
How
first
could a founder
hire,
figure that out?
I think the first hire is really like Again, I going back to what Kyle was saying, any skill set that is just missing from either the co-founders or the founder, to supplement that and patch up that skill set as fast as possible. And don't I'd say the first hire is going to be your most expensive hire in terms of time and effort, because if you hire for someone who's a very junior person, you will pay for that back in time and in mistakes and all that stuff. But if you pay for this person and they come experienced, they come knowledgeable, and it's going to fill that gap of knowledge for you, you're essentially acquiring this knowledge by paying for it. And the more you pay, the better the quality, hopefully. And that's going to help you navigate through certain things, avoid pitfalls. So I think it's for us, I think, was really hiring someone, because Mike and I, we came from the direct writer side, where we were selling policies for a single insurance company, but we didn't have knowledge of the brokering side. So having that broad knowledge of brokering, understanding the market and everything like that was critical for us to succeed right out of the gate. Otherwise, it would have taken Michael and I months, if not more, to learn the brokering process, right? So we essentially hired that as our first to understand the business. So going back to the question, is that first hire, if you're venturing into, I've seen this all the time with like tech founders. They venture into a business like insurance without any insurance knowledge, and they don't hire any insurance people to gain that knowledge. So how do you expect to succeed? You're only, guessing what the market needs. So hire that expert in the area that you're going to operate in.
So hire someone to fill that skill gap, knowledge. So hire someone to fill the skill gap, knowledge gap, and don't cheap out, is what you
Yes.
guys are saying. No, that's good. And what if this founder is just great at everything, and they're great at everything? I think a good first hire, in my opinion, I think you guys both nailed it. But I'll just add another one. I'll add another one to the mix. What I see often is a really good EA. So if the founders if there's multiple founders, especially if there's one, I don't know, there's definitely going to be some skills gap they need to be bringing on. But if there's a couple founders, a couple partners, and they're tackling different domains and they're really good, so they have their bases covered, I think that EA is a really good first hire, because that'll help them set up the structure for the business and manage their time and set them up for the next hires and help them with those next hires and train those next hires, almost like really take time off their plate and allow them to replicate their time more efficiently. So that would be my suggestion if there was no skills gap.
Yeah, no, I like it. I think that's good. All right, so last again, like we're almost on the hour. One final question I would have is, what piece of advice would you give that you feel is kind of potentially contradictory, or you don't hear it enough, you didn't hear it starting out, something that you've learned, or that if you were to go back and you'd say, if I focused on this one thing, it would have a material impact, and I didn't know it, or I didn't hear it until it was, until I had to go through the trenches to find it out. I'll give you an example of what I would sort of look to. So one thing you alluded to earlier, which was the pivot. And I think starting out, I definitely perceived the pivot as a bad thing. I perceived any possible failure, a pivot, as a failure, and any potential failure as a critical error on my part and judgment or whatever. And it's really interesting because, going through the process, doing lots of reading, and the experience of starting businesses, it is a very similar journey. And one thing that continues to come to the sort of float to the top for me is this concept of comparative advantage. And what it really means to me is, what can you do, or what does your business do that it can do really well that other companies can't? And that relates to me, at least, in terms of, if you're a small company, how are you going to compete with big companies? Because there's a lot of literature and there's a lot of theory around, going after markets that the big incumbents aren't really interested in because they're not very profitable, or trying to undercut them on price or whatever. And what I have learned, and I think needs to be more emphasized, and I would emphasize to myself, is part of the benefit of being small is being really nimble. And again, the Rob Snyder perspective of like, you don't need anything to sell, right? You can get out and talk to people with a theory and a thesis and say, hey, is this an issue for you? And how serious is it? And what are you prepared to pay to solve it? Like, if you can find those market opportunities, the benefit is that you can pivot. If you're comparing yourself to a large company, they take a long time to make changes, if they make changes at all. Recently, Jamie Dimon, head of JP Morgan, was ranting about how one of the processes internally required 14 committees to approve it, right? Like, that's what you're up against, right? That's the competitive advantage that you have, is that you can pivot. If you hit a wall, if your thesis doesn't pan out, you technically can change in a minute. You can immediately turn your business in a different direction, or you can chase whatever direction that wind is blowing. And I think it's it's definitely a cultural phenomenon, because again, coming from Canada, we perceive that risk, that negative risk, as a bad thing. We perceive that pivot as a bad thing. But if you were to embrace it and say, I can do a lot, I can test a lot of stuff, I can try a lot of things without a lot of cost, without a lot of time commitment, that other companies simply cannot do, that is the comparative advantage. That's how you win compared to the big players that have the time and the resources.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
really good.
that makes sense. Yeah, I think it's for me, it was the, learning how to cut out the noise. There's so much noise when you're just starting out, and we learn about different things that other companies are doing. This company is doing this thing more efficient. This thing just deploy this new technology. This other company is just having AI like all over their company. It's there's so much noise out there that you start to question like yourself, and like, hey, you know what? Am I really behind, or am I going in the right direction, or am I making or am I focusing on the wrong things? So really, I think early on is, for us, was really cutting out that noise. And sometimes we hear about these things. Sometimes it comes up in Michael and our discussion, and we start to say, hey, you know what? Are we on the right track? Right? It's good to question that once in a while, but I think having that laser focus, right from the beginning, this is what you're set out to do, and to really focus on that every day, right? And every day, get out of bed, like, this is my focus. This is my focus, and this is what I'm going to do. Whether it takes AI to do it, or whether it takes some newer technology, quantum physics, whatever it is. But having that focus on solving that problem that you set out to solve, that is the key, I think, and cutting out all the noise, because there will always be this new thing someone else is doing that may not fit, and you start looking at that thing, it just distracts you from your core focus and your goal, right? So I think we realized that, I guess, in our second year, is that I always go back, and Mike, you remember, I always ask that question, what is the software doing for us? Is it really helping us generate more business? And coming back to that question all the time, right? And I think that's really helps us in developing ourselves, and just really focusing on growing what is our competitive advantage. And then also what you mentioned, Kyle, like, we're nimble, we can adjust, we can do things so quickly, using that advantage, questioning every decisions we're making with the North Star. And that I think is just the one of the key.
All right, Mike, last thought, final thought.
One. Yeah, so for me, I think capitalization. Being well capitalized certainly helps. This is not a necessity. You could run a business without it. However, you're going to pay the price for these things later, and I'll tell you why. When you're not well capitalized starting a business, you're going to cut corners in the beginning. These corners, you can fix them later, but it's going to cost you more money. You're going to cheap out on lawyers. You're going to get a budget lawyer. You're going to get a budget tax planner. You're going to get a budget everything. And you're going to have to come back to all these things later, and you're going to have to fix them when you do have money. You're going to need a new shareholder agreement, new buy-sell agreements, new ESOP. The ESOP's got to have to be all redone. So if you can capitalize yourself well in the beginning and tackle these things early on and set up a really solid structure, it'll make your life a lot easier later on. But not everyone has that luxury. But if you can, focus on raising some capital.
That's
you
that's
go.
a good point. A good point. That's I can definitely understand.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, we'll call it there. Thanks very much for joining us, and we look forward to chatting with you on the next time. Thank you.
Thanks.